My guest today is Dan Pinchbeck, co-founder of The Chinese Room. We discuss his game industry journey, starting with Half-Life 2 mods back in 2007, to taking Dear Esther commercial, to forming the company officially, and then unfortunately didn't let go of their entire team in 2017. We cover the Sumo acquisition, and of course, their most recent game, Vampire the Masquerade, Bloodlines 2. Dan and I get into the highs and lows of running a studio, what really happened behind the scenes, why he left the studio, and he shares his thoughts on burnout, the AI hype, and the state of the games industry. This is a really fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get on with it. Hiya, Dan. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for months. I think we first spoke about it it was like June or July time, something like that. It was like in the summer,
Yeah,
wasn't it? So yeah, I've been really looking forward to this. Now, I've known about the Chinese Room for a very, very long time. Like, honestly, my favorite game of yours is Dear Esther, which goes way back. But I think we should start even further back than that because the Chinese Room has a really interesting story and you've worked on lots of different things over the years. So let's start in the early days. It was 2007, right? When you first started with mods for Half-Life 2. Is that right?
yeah. So it started off with I was working at the University of Portsmouth um, as a lecturer, and I was also as part of that gig. They were they gave us the opportunity to do a PhD as well, and I'll be doing stuff I worked in new media and digital arts beforehand, and which is how I met Jess, my better half, and I was teaching stuff like 3D Studio Max and Photoshop, and I'm really, really not very techy. And in this terrible situation where I was like, the students are catching up with me and they're going to get past me in terms of knowledge, and that's really, really, really bad. And I'm doing this PhD about, originally it was about story and immersion, about how if you use story, you could boost immersion in virtual spaces through using non-technological kind of devices. And that kind of moved over into being a PhD about the way story is used in games. And I was particularly kind of interested in how story really is just a gameplay mechanic, and the sort of academic division between story and gameplay is just makes no sense. It's silly. And the best games don't make that distinction, but it's still quite a hardwired thing in both industry and academia. And so the sort of thing of wanting to try and find some time away from teaching to focus on research and sort of having these ideas about research questions kind of led me to make an application to the Arts and Humanities Research Council, basically for some funding to say there's a lot of theory floating around game studies and there's a lot of practice going on in the games industry. And there are some really interesting questions which no one's asking. I don't know why academia is not asking it. They're asking it theoretically, but not practically. And the games industry is not asking it because it's commercially so high risk. But that doesn't mean to say they're not good questions. And it was stuff like saying, if you removed all the traditional mechanics from a game and just had story, would that still be a compelling experience? Was one of them, which led to Dear Esther. Or what happens if you take Doom 3 and only load the shotgun with rubber bullets so the zombies get back up again after a few seconds? So, which was kind of funny, but also the idea was going first person shooters, which is what I was specializing in. Start with a complex environment and you start here. And as time goes on, the environment gets more and more simplified because you remove everything from the environment. And when the environment's empty, you go to another environment. So what happens if you invert that? And because you can't kill anything, the environment gets busier and busier and busier as gameplay goes on, which is quite like an interesting kind of question to ask. But the only way you could really answer it would be to build it. And I'd like modded Doom and stuff back in the day. So it just felt like, particularly with the sort of like the really, really big, amazing modding community around ModDB at that point and around Half-Life 2, it was like, well, there's this audience here. They're really receptive. There's a lot of experimental stuff going on. Why don't we try and get some money, get a couple of people together and like build some mods and just ask these questions? And if they fail, it doesn't matter as long as they fail in an interesting way. So we made initially three. We made a Conscientious Objector, which was the Doom 3 mod. We made a multiplayer mod of Half-Life 2, which was outline soccer, which is where you're basically playing football, but you're punting outlines around with gravity guns, which is very cool. But of course, because it was multiplayer, we had no idea how to launch it as multiplayer. No one ever played the thing, but it was cool. And we made Dear Esther. And then that was kind of it. And then we went on to make a fourth one, a horror one called Korsakovia. And I guess that was where things changed, because about the same time as we made Korsakovia, two things happened simultaneously. First is that Robert Briscoe got in touch and said, look, I played Dear Esther, I really, really like it. I've just come off Mirror's Edge. I'd love to reskin it. And Jess was like, well, I'd love to be able to get proper musicians on it, and it'd be great to put some proper art on it. So we started working on that. And weirdly, around the same time, Frictional released Amnesia, and we started meeting each other at a lot of the same events. There's a big thing about not games and story-driven games going on at the time. And that kind of set us off, really. So by the time sort of Korsakovia was out, we were already in production of the commercial version of Dear Esther, just the three of us at that point. And then we kept talking to Frictional. And by the time Dear Esther had shipped, we'd already started working on a machine for pigs with Frictional. And suddenly we're a game studio. And we're like, we're employing people, and we're this actual studio making games, and we're selling them and everything. And it was a bit weird.
Yeah, sounds almost accidental. Like you started out just doing cool mods and then somehow ended up hiring people.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is because Jess and I are both artists. So, I mean, Jess is sort of, best known as a games composer, but she's also a choral composer. She's done sound walks, installations. So she was a digital sound artist when I met her. She trained as a film composer. And I was working in sort of like, not even really a narrative in kind of new media arts. I was doing like marketing and stuff like that. So we really kind of were a couple of artists who made a game which did really, really well, and then went, "Oh, this feels interesting," and we sort of sat in that furrow for a while, I guess. Rather than being this big, we're going to start a games company, we're going to grow, we're going to have all this sort of stuff going on. It was much more. This is interesting. Let's just sort of like ride it for as long as we can because it's fun.
Yeah, it sounds much more organic. Sort of you just grew with it and sort of changed things as you went. And so, like, yeah, well, you mentioned Dear Esther there. I honestly have so many clear memories of playing that game because one of the things I remember was like the lighting and the atmosphere was just so beautiful and so striking in that game. I absolutely loved it. And then, yeah, you mentioned you started work on like Amnesia and some more sort of then horror type games. I guess in the early days, Chinese Room was mostly known for being like sort of walking simulators, that kind of thing. And then you move into sort of more the horror side of things. Could you talk to me a bit about sort of how you break that stereotype and yeah, why it
Uh,
is you wanted to move more into the horror side?
you don't, I think, is the short answer. If you do something well at the beginning of your career, you're probably going to be doing it for the rest of your career, or it's what's going to be expected of you. I have a very, very weird relationship with the whole walking simulator thing. So on one hand, I made a lot of them. Every single game I've made, I've felt like it's been me on one side of the room going, can we please just have some proper mechanics in this? Can we please load this thing out of the mechanics, do it properly? And on the other side of the room has been the development team going, yeah, but we don't need as much of that. We could do a bit less. You proved we can do a bit less. And they always end up really, really simple. And I'm like, I want to make a first person shooter. That's all I like. So there's never been this there wasn't this thing of going, oh, we're a walking simulator company. We kind of went, we are a company that is run by a composer and a writer. So music and story are really important to us. In the same way that if we were run by a technologist, breaking technological ground would probably be really important to us. It's just the nature of who we were running the studio. Um, and it was part of yes, there was a sort of a definite thing in that of kind of going, most games don't do either of these very well. And there's no excuse for not doing either of them very well because they're much cheaper and easier to get right than most of the other problems you have to solve as a game developer. So it's nuts that you're shipping games with bad stories, bad voice acting, or bad quality music. There's just no excuse for it because compared to like AI and ballistics, they're a walk in the park technically to do. You just have to approach them the right way. So, I mean, Amnesia was, I loved Data Center. I love horror games anyway. And so the sort of the opportunity to do that felt very natural. And like, because we had met Thomas and then Jens Nielsen was still with the company at that point, we'd talked a lot at like various things we'd met. And there's a real sort of meeting of minds. Like Thomas Grip always said, for him, the success of Amnesia was not anything to do with tech. It was because actually they just saw it as a psychological exercise. How do
Mm.
you understand player psychology? How do you manipulate player psychology? How do you make that work? And they did it brilliantly, and it was extraordinary. So that kind of sense of going, this is about how you make someone think and feel was a real meeting point, I suppose, in terms of how we all thought about games. So it seemed fairly natural to sort of do that. And of course, they were working on Soma at the time, and they hadn't announced it or couldn't say anything about it. So like, we want to get a game out in between Data Descent and Soma, but Soma's years off. So it was quite again, it wasn't like massively strategic. It was just it felt like a really interesting thing to do, and we liked them.
Mm.
And as soon as we started talking about it, I wrote like a one-page kind of like doc called "We Are the Pig," which was really basically, I think, at that point, me screaming into the void about the state of the country. And sort of this idea of going, we're sliding backwards into a kind of really fucked neo-Victorian age. And I mean, if that was back in 2013, I mean, we've gone past that now.
Mm.
But it just felt like it was right. And Jess started writing music straight away, and we sort of like started working with a couple of people we realized in sort of art design stuff. And it just felt like, oh, let's just do this. This feels like it's fun. I think at that point, there wasn't a huge studio burden. We were still working sort of half and half in and out of the University of Portsmouth. TCR was only a brand rather than a legal entity at that point. So we were all employees of the university. Um, yeah, so it just felt sort of natural, really. And I love making and writing horror games. They're great. They're so much fun to do. They're one of the most fun games to make, I think.
Yeah, I always think it would be interesting to work on a horror game because it's so much about the vibes and the tension and the psychology. Like it's such a fascinating thing to do. And yeah, honestly, I'm terrible at playing horror games. I get so scared.
I'm finding now, I'm just like, the problem is having worked on a few of them, you just go, I just know exactly how this all works. Like everyone
Seen
always said
behind the
when like
curtain.
every other frictional game that's come out, people are like, have you played it? I'm like, yeah, do you find it scary? I'm like, no. They're like, why not? Because I know exactly how Thomas's mind works and know where he's going to go and what he's going to do and how these things are built. Because I've seen behind the curtain, and they're brilliant at doing it. But it definitely doesn't quite have the same. It's difficult to kind of make me jump these days. I'm a bit
Yeah,
jaded.
I guess it's less immersive when you know exactly how it's made and who's pulling the strings and how.
But I think that's the cool thing about the really, really great horror games. It's why this sort of, stuff like why Silent Hill 2 is still unbelievably good, because they just go, well, we can make you jump. But actually, what a really great horror game does is it just gets completely under your skin. And it's not about scaring you in the moment. It's about just gently turning up the pressure emotionally until you're absolutely, completely wound up because the whole thing's just got its hooks in you. And I think the really great horror in any medium, whether that's game, whether that's film, whether that's books, it understands that thing of going, how do you make people generate their own fear? And then
Mm.
if you can get people to a state where they're generating their own fear, they'll take that fear away from the game with them. And then it haunts them. And then you've got a title which people will remember, and it's really sort of doing something very special, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting insight. And so you mentioned there that you were a team employed by the university. So when did you sort of make that leap to found or co-found the Chinese Room as an official studio?
So again, it was this weird sort of like two things happened simultaneously. And the first one was that Dear Esther was coming out, and universities have like charitable status and they have all sorts of stuff in their charter. And when we got the Steam contract back, we put it in front of the legal team at the university. They're like, we can't sign this. We can't sign away this degree of liability. And I sort of said to them, kind of without like a massive kind of even thinking about it, I went, oh, you better give me the IP then. And they went, all right then. And I still don't know quite how that happened, because I look back on it and I go, I just went, well, it's not worth anything to you if you can't release it. So you might as well give it to me and I'll do something with it. And they signed the IP over. And I think if they'd have any idea what would have happened if it was released, they probably wouldn't have done that. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Um, so we set TTR up as a legal entity at that point, just so we could actually release it. It wasn't like this big kind of like, again, commercial thing. It was like, this is the only way we get this game out into the world, is if it's released on something like Steam, in which case we have to be a legal entity to do that. And then you sort of add on from that. And then we were still finishing. We're about 6 months out from the end of our work on Pigs, and Esther had got nominated for an IGF and also won an Indicate Award. So I've been over to LA a couple of times, and while I was over there, met the then Sony Santa Monica third party team who were just putting the finishing touches on Journey. And
Mm.
they were swelling because PS4 was coming out. They were actively signing small companies, and their remit, as they told us then, was, we don't have to make any money from these games. We just have to make PlayStation seem like a cooler platform than Xbox. So they were bringing in stuff that they thought just felt really, really interesting, and talking to teams who are doing interesting stuff. And they said, what would you feel about doing a sort of a Dear Esther for us? And we went, well, we sort of done Dear Esther. it'd be kind of cool to do a non-linear open world version of that actually really goes, this tells a story in a way that only a game can tell it because the player has such freedom of movement within it. And so we started working on that, still working for the university. We did the prototype with the university and got another Arts and Humanities Research Council grant, this time because we'd hit all these roadblocks and discovered all these ways in which universities at that point couldn't release commercial games. We were like, okay, well, if you give us money to be able to do the development, the prototype, we'll basically deliberately hit every single hurdle along the way. And we'll uncover all of the legal problems, and then we'll just put those in the public domain and you can have them. Which was quite cool. Again, it's one of those things where I think, I can't believe actually someone said yes, which was, I think, pretty progressive of them. And they sort of understood the way that the world was going.
Mm.
And so at the end of that, when Sony said, okay, right, prototype's over, we want to put you on a full contract. And they kind of said, we don't want to sign a contract with the university. And we were like, well, we're going to be doing this for 3 years. So we came out of the university, formed the company properly and employed people then, and just transferred everyone that was working on the demo at the uni across to being TCR staff. And then that was it. At that point, we were like a full-blown commercial company. So it was a bit of a circuitous route to get there.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting route because it's so different from so many people's ideas of what it's like to start a game studio. Like many people are like, I've got friends from the industry, we've got an artist, a coder, let's make a studio, work on a prototype, get
Yeah.
some funding, whereas yours is such an interesting start. And so how many people were on your team at that point when you first started?
So Esther was 3 of us, plus a couple of people helping out. There's a freelance coder, freelance audio person. Pigs, we were about a core team, I think, of about 8 people. And Rapture was, I think, our biggest team was 15,
Mm.
and sort of people came and went. But it was, I don't think it ever got any bigger than 15. And we didn't really have freelancers, so it was a really tiny team.
I feel like 15 people is almost the perfect sweet spot of like, it's such a nice small studio size where everyone knows each other. There's not too much middle management or process in the way, and you can just ship really cool things.
Yeah, I think whatever happens in the future in terms of like, the extent to which I'm doing anything, I don't think I'd ever go above sort of 15 or 20 people again. I think being able to every time that something needs discussing, the whole team is there in front of you to discuss it, and you can have that. It's really the only way of doing it. I just feel like from having been sort of like in sort of like big teams, they're just they're so hard to keep that communication solid. I think it's one of the reasons why games innately tend towards being homogenized, because you rely so heavily on tacit understanding of how things are done and what games ought to be, because it's so hard to keep people focused on, like a large team, on specifics. Like even just the really simple thing of like, getting artists particularly to read scripts. If you found an artist who'll read a script, you've struck gold. They don't. They're visual people.
Mm.
And writers and narrative designers create these vast confluence encyclopedias, and you're like going, no one's reading this. You've spent 6 months on it. Nobody's reading it. Um, and really what you want to do basically is go, I've got a programmer, a designer, and an animator sitting around one desk, and we're just going to let them run for as long as we humanly can before anybody else gets involved. And that is the best way of making games. There's no two ways about it. And it's why small teams regularly are the people that are breaking ground and creating breakout hits, because you can just operate at a different speed.
Yeah, it's kind of the difference between being like a big studio, which is more like a cruise liner, and you're in the little speedboat, right? And you can quickly chop and change and you can ship things faster. And yeah, it feels like the energy is always higher in a smaller team like that.
I think it is, and it's also means pressure as well. Then big studios. I think it's the people that I have probably 15 years, 16 years, whatever down the line, the most respect for are like, and they are the rarest people to find, are really, really, really good project managers and producers who work on large titles, because they're not the rock stars who get talked about, but they're the people who basically ensure it gets from one point to another, because they're an absolute nightmare to try and steer those ships. And it is that thing, because you've got so many sort of parallel threads working, because you have to, because development cycles have got shorter as money's got tighter. that you have to almost set teams off in parallel, knowing full well that if one team hits a roadblock, it could cause you huge problems everywhere else because someone's already built the solution to a problem that no longer exists. And then you've got 6 months to unpick that. And then Unreal update their engine halfway through and you just rip it all up and start again.
It's always a pain when that happens. But yeah, being a producer is such a difficult job, and often, yeah, as you say, it's almost a thankless job because you are the one that's spinning all the plates and keeping everything moving and trying to just keep everybody moving forward and trying to ship on time and on budget. And when budgets are tight, it's such a difficult role. So yeah, kudos to all the producers out there.
Definitely,
So
yeah.
we talked a little bit there about how like you started the studio and you grew it to like sort of hitting that sort of 15 with some freelancers, which again is such a lovely, lovely size. I'd be intrigued to know a little bit about the process and what happened around sort of 2017, 2018, because that was such a big turning point for you and it must have been a really hard time as a leader. So I guess just for anybody who might not be familiar, sort of around that time, you and Jess unfortunately had to let go of your team and sort of get rid of your studio, work from home, which is such a difficult thing to do. I mean, I've been there, I've had to let people go and it's devastating. And often we don't hear about that from the studio head side. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what that process was like for you, because I expect it must have been really difficult, but you probably don't get much chance to talk about that side of it.
Yeah, it was. It was awful. It was terrible. And it was, I think it's a really interesting, probably it's people that have been in the industry for a while will sort of, again, know this story quite well, but it doesn't tend to get talked about a lot. So we very naively assumed, because Rapture was such a hit, um, we were like, oh, no problem. We'll just pick up another gig. And then the Sony Santa Monica creative team split and went off to be Annapurna Interactive, which basically ripped the spine out of third-party development in Sony America. The corporate agenda shifted there. So the gig we thought we were moving on to evaporated, and suddenly we're there. We're going, okay, we've got 15 people, we've got a huge wage bill, and I think under different circumstances, we could have and probably the business model would have been to have stripped back down to about 4 people and started prototyping and started looking for it. But we were really kind of like, no, we're not a company that lets people go. We don't do boom and bust. So we kept everybody on. Our bank account just basically started, just someone basically set fire to it and started burning. And we had this sort of time bomb. And for the next, I suppose it was about 12 months, it's so long, the process of getting anything signed. I was scooting off all over the place. I was exhausted. Like I was barely ever at home, desperately trying to get a gig signed. And we eventually managed to secure the Google Daydream gig, which none of us really wanted to do because it's proprietary tech. And we were like, we're not really very into VR. It's mobile VR, which is even harder. It's proprietary tech. We don't know how long it's going to last. So this is a lost game. Whatever we do with this game is gone. It's vanished. It probably won't be playable within 6 months of us making it, and we won't have it on our CVs, but it'll keep us alive for 18 months. So we took that gig and I think I think it's a good game we made with So Let Us Melt. I think it's definitely some of Jess's best work, and there's a lot about it. But it was just that wow. And of course, the problem was after we're coming off the back of So Let Us Melt, and we were into sort of like the last 8 months of that, and we were looking at basically saying we burn our safety net pre getting this gig, and this gig's kept us afloat, but there's no more safety net at the end of this. And again, I was racing around trying to get something signed, but everyone was like, "Well, you just make walking simulators." Walking simulators. Well, we'll give you a little bit of money to make a walking simulator. And I'm like, well, I don't really want to, but okay. Oh, well, the problem is walking simulators don't sell. I'm like, yes, that's why I told you we didn't want to make a walking simulator. We'd make it round and around and around. And the weird thing is there's the very, very big thing in the industry still where people go, "Have that team made anything?" And weirdly, you've got a better chance of being hired if your team is a team that has already made a game, even if that game's very bad, than if you've got a team that's seen as a new team, even if it's made up of a load of industry veterans who've got very good games on their CVs. And it's a really very weird blind spot that the industry has that I think is based around how important work for hiring co-dev is in the industry, that's seen as where the real trust comes from. But when you apply it to original IP, it just doesn't work as a model. It just falls apart. And we can see that with the number of established teams that go, we're making new IP, and it just doesn't go anywhere. So we got, as we were getting to, it was probably about 6 months out, and Jess and I were looking at it and going, we are a few months from when we ship of basically closing. We've got nothing,
Mm.
and we've got nothing personally at that point. We spent all our money, and we're not going to make any money from this game because it's a mobile VR title. So there is no windfall bonus or anything. We've had all the money there is to have, and that's what's been keeping us afloat. So we made the really, really difficult call, and I still think it was the right call to make. About 4 months out, we got the team together and said, we're shuttering off, we ship this title. And they were brilliant. They took it so well, but they're also really devastated. It's really hard to then spend 3 months working on a game when you know you're losing your job at the end of it.
Mm.
But it felt like the alternative was they finish the game, they go, hooray, and we go, yes, by the way, you're all fired, which felt worse, but there's not really a good outcome to that. And then we worked with them over the next couple of weeks, and I think everyone left with a job by the time the game shipped. So the good thing about it is that people had time to line stuff up. So everyone kind of landed on their feet. Okay. But then we sort of were left going, well, is this it? Are we going to be in, or are we going to be out? And for the last year, I'd been working with an agent called Joel Benton, who was helping trying to get a game signed. And I was totally burnt out in complete state by the end of it. And then he sort of gave it a sort of respectable time. Then he came to me and he went, do you know Sumo? Because I think they might be interested in talking to you about rebooting the studio as a Sumo studio. And I met Carl and met Paul, and liked them, liked what their sort of like the sense of what it was, like the fact that it was a sort of it felt like a kind of an old fashioned British studio. It wasn't overtly over corporate at that point. They liked what we did, and we just got talking and thought, well, again, why not give it a shot, see if it works out? And it sort of from there basically went back in and rebuilt up to the little Orpheus team.
Yeah, it's such a tricky like process you've been through all of that, like that emotional load, that mental load, and that burden. I'm not surprised you were feeling burnt out because it's a very difficult and very lonely position to be in when you're having to go through all of that. But it sounds like you did the best you could for the team, though. Like giving them 3 months notice is like loads. Like it's much more than people would often get, and that's definitely the nicer way to go about it.
It's this terrible business. I mean, that's the thing. It's really hard, and I think that's why it's. I'm always a bit wary of going. It was really hard because I don't like it when particularly execs go, "Oh, it's really difficult. I had to do redundancies," and I always think you weren't made redundant, so it might have been hard for you, but it wasn't as hard as the people who lost their jobs. So I think it is important to kind of be aware of that. But it was, yeah, it's a huge. I mean, if you're running a business, you are responsible for people's livelihoods. You have an absolute responsibility for them. And one of the reasons I think that we said yes to Sumo was the first time I sat down with Carl Cavers. And I've not met him. I think I've met him really, really briefly once before. We didn't really know him. And he said, you had to let your team go. Is that bad? And I was like, yeah, it's horrible. It's horrible. And he was like, okay. Well, he said, well, the basic line that we have at Sumo is we don't fire anyone unless we have to. And he said, I had a studio that hit the rocks way back in my past, and I had to let a lot of people go. And he said, afterwards, I went, I'm never doing that again unless I have to. And that sort of attitude of going, you have responsibility to your team, I think was really important to me in terms of going, are we going to fit with this in terms of selling the values that we have as a studio? We're always really, really front and center, but always said it's not just the games you make, it's how you make them. It was really, really important, sort of ethical development. So I think that kind of made me go, well, okay, if they are kind of genuinely team first, then yeah, I think we probably can make this work. And that was as big a part of it as it wasn't just like, here's a checkbook. It was, kind of, yes, it would be nice to be able to make more games, but it was also important that we would have kind of like creative control, and there would be an ethical approach to staffing and things like that were just as important.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually about that creative control because it's a very different thing running your own studio to running a studio that's owned by someone else. So did you manage to
Yeah.
keep the control that you had prior to the acquisition?
I would say, through until Bloodlines, which was a different thing because that was a publisher's IP, but Little Orpheus was, it sort of helped that we signed Little Orpheus like almost straight away. I don't think we'd even completed acquisition. I think we were still going through. It was this really weird thing that was probably like the ink wasn't quite dry. I'm not sure exactly where we were legally. And Paul Port was like, "Look, we're going over to America to see Apple. Have you got anything you can put in front of them?" And at that point, Little Orpheus was a first person puzzler with these like dual hit rotating cuff tools that you sort of span around in real time and like weapon wheels and did all this puzzle stuff. And it was really kind of quite acrobatic and all sorts of stuff. And we were like, "Oh, we're never going to get the money for that because that's like a big AAA." But the idea of this kind of Walter Mitty lying through his teeth, Russian cosmonaut trying to talk his way out of the firing squad was just felt like a really great story. Um, and so I think I went over to Apple with 4 slides on a PowerPoint and just talked. And they loved it, and they got it, and they were like, and of course, because it was the beginning of Apple Arcade, I think they had quite big budgets to play with, and they're like, we can take a punt on this. But I think because that happened, there was sort of a degree of going, well, yeah, it's Apple's money. No one's really made anything like this. Let's go for it. So, and I think because Little Orpheus did so well, I was sort of pitching Still Wakes the Deep at around the same time as we were finishing Little Orpheus. And I think between the sort of like the track record of doing horror and that we'd really proved ourselves with Little Orpheus, like Sumo were always pretty good about going, no, you know what you're doing. You often do this. In some ways, weirdly, I think Still Wakes the Deep would have been a better game if Sumo had been a bit harder on us at the beginning of it and gone, this prototyping's taken too long and those mechanics aren't quite where they ought to be. It was, I'm not an enormous fan of the blank check. I don't think it really does you many favors. I think it's much better to have a lot of checks and balances in there.
Yeah, it's good if you're accountable, right? And like checking in and keeping it
Yeah.
exposed just a little bit.
Well, I think when you're sort of like a self-funded, self-publishing studio, then you are because you're answerable to each other and to your bank
Mm.
balance. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'd always really got on well with it. And sort of like Sumo as well, because I was like going, I'm aware I'm spending your money because I've been spending our money for the last few years, and I know how serious that is. And this isn't just like I've not. I think you sometimes get people that have come up through, particularly through big studios, and they've risen through big studios all the way. It's always been someone else's money. It's always been a little bit abstract. And so asking for an extension, I'll just ask for an extension. I'll just overspend. And you're going, when that extension means, you missing a mortgage payment,
Mm.
you kind of tend to treat development a little bit differently. And I think you can see that in big studios that are run by people that used to run small studios are often some of the most financially successful or financially tight because you're just embedded with that attitude of going, if I blow this, my kids aren't going to the same school because I'm moving because we've got no more money. And you just treat development differently as a result.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're much more, aware of the money, but also the responsibility, not just to yourself and your own kids, but to your team and their
Yeah,
mortgages and their
absolutely.
kids. And like, it's almost like every pound or dollar really matters because it all impacts your runway, right? And you can literally see, oh, I can employ these people for 4 months, 6 months more, and then what? And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think, as you say, if you've worked in more the bigger studios, you've not had the visibility on that, it can be very hard to just grasp how much those decisions matter in terms of
Yeah,
finance.
and we've kind of all know the stories. Like I know, a friend of mine whose studio went under while they were waiting for a check, and they
Mm.
closed mid-development, not because there was any reason for them to close, but just because the publisher couldn't get their shit together to pay them on time, and they kept saying, "We're going to have to fire our entire team in like a week and a half. We're going to have to fire our entire team in a week. We're going to have to fire our entire team in 4 days." Yeah, it's coming, it's coming. We'll sort it out, process, and then the publisher phones them up one day, and they're like, "Well, it's gone. The studio's dead." Like, why? Well, because we told you 3 weeks ago we're going to have to fire everybody and you didn't pay us. And if you've been freelance, and I mean, Jess is, has always been a freelancer and still is. I think every freelancer knows this of like going big companies, even mid-sized companies, even some small companies, they hang on to the money as late as possible. They eke it out, they dribble it out. And if you're a freelancer, it's so brutal to try and ride those waves. But I think one thing which is, has changed in the industry and is currently, with the current situation of the sort of sheer number of layoffs, that hopefully the kind of the good that may come out of that is it means there's an awful lot of very talented, very experienced people who are now saying, I'm not going to take that. And if they're not offered the right gig from a company, they'll walk because they know they can walk somewhere. Because if you're a programmer with 10 plus years experience, you're so valuable now that you don't have to put up with a company treating you shoddily. And that pushes the power balance back towards developers a little bit. And the more power sort of that equates, the less power that's in sort of like big money and execs and publishers, and the more power that sits with developers, better games will get made, and games will get made in fairer, more equitable ways. And that can only be a good thing. So hopefully the sort of the fact that the market is now flooded with very, very talented, experienced people who are going, I don't want to, whatever happens, I don't want to go back to that, may mean that we do see a bit of change in the industry that is desperately, desperately needed.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I guess the big question is whether or not those people stick around, right? Because there is so many amazing people out there looking for jobs, but who are also struggling to find jobs, which
Yeah,
is wild. The industry is in such a mess. I'm hoping a lot of these people can somehow club together and start their own new studios or do
I
indie
think
stuff.
it will.
Talent is
Yeah, I think it will come around again. I think we're in a sort of weird kind of place. It's a bit like when supermarkets, which they've actually got away with it, so it's maybe slightly different. I think the notion of teaching a community of consumers, not kind of consumers, use that word, 'cause we're talking about money, but we're talking about like players, that they shouldn't have to pay for the media they consume. You can get it for free. There'll be a sale in 6 months. Will be slashed down. It'll go from $50 down to $1. Big companies can weather that for a while, but it puts small and medium companies out of business. So it's a deliberate strategy. It's like acquisition. You strip the value out of a company to drive its value down, then you buy it when it's cheap. And it's a similar kind of thing of going, if you're worried about competition from smaller studios, well, just price them out by slashing the prices on your big games, because you don't have to do that. So sale culture reduces this notion, the idea that you have to pay for your games. And it's insane. It's hard to kind of grasp how mad it is as an idea to go, we're going to literally train the people that we rely on for income, that they don't have to pay us for the things we have to spend a huge amount of time and money making. It's mad. And it's, of course, it's no wonder that, after a while, people are going to go, well, why should I pay $80 for a game? Games are increasing in price, not just because they cost more, but because less people are buying them at full price. So because no one's buying it on day one because its price is so inflated, it means it has to go on sale faster, which means people wait for the sale, they don't buy. And the whole thing's just a cycle, and nobody benefits from it. It's stupid. It's extraordinary that if you talk to 90% of developers, they'll go, yes, that's why it doesn't work. But it's still the model which was pursued in terms of the sort of like the financial high point of the industry. And that's because I think the thing which we don't talk about very often is that we kind of imagine games as being a closed financial ecosystem. You make games, it costs this much money, and then you ship it and it makes that much money. And hopefully if that much money is more than this much money, you carry in business. But if we're talking about sort of any sort of reasonably sized company, we're not talking about that at all. That's not what's going on. What's going on is money from investors, from mining, arms, pharmaceuticals, whatever else it is. That money is passing through the games industry, and it comes in when it's cheap and it goes out when it's high. And that sort of like is simple kind of like high capitalism stock market stuff is then controlling how games get made and who gets fired and who gets hired and everything. And it's got nothing to do with the games anymore.
Hmm.
And that means that most people working in the games industry, they're not, they're able to exercise virtually zero control over their stability, because actually the money that is determining whether their studio lives or dies has got nothing to do with the game they're making and everything to do with high level investment. And it's never going to be a model which is going to benefit players, developers. It's not about that. So if it breaks, if the industry breaks, it's going to be awful and painful. Games as a medium will weather that crash. They have weathered crashes like that before. And if it returns more power to the actual making of the games rather than external investment, it'll hurt. It'll hurt for a lot of people, but it might just kind of like save the medium in the long run.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one because we are on that roller coaster. And as you say, there's been many highs, many lows, lots of dips. And I feel like the post-COVID sort of correction thing we've had where studios grew really quickly and then suddenly we were allowed outside again, people stopped buying as many games. I feel like we're slowly coming to the end of that dip, and hopefully we'll come out of it. But like you said, it's going to take time. And then who knows what that normal will look like after. And in the meantime, as you said, we've got the big issue with investment where like, I go to a lot of startup events, I meet a lot of VCs, and sort of in my previous studio did a lot of fundraising. And it feels like even still, the vast majority of investment is going to anybody who is using AI. You drop any of the buzzword bingo in there, you're using
Yeah,
AI, you're using
absolutely.
agents, using LLMs, funding. If you're not using that, it's like there's less in there. And for game studios, like many of the people in the industry don't want to be using AI, or at least not using it that much. And yet it's where the funding is. So it's like, well, do you sell your soul to keep going or not? It's really tricky.
I'm not even sure that people are sort of, it's the usual thing, people are evangelizing AI. I mean, it's they don't even know what they know, what it is they're evangelizing. And I mean, that's the thing of going, when you say, are you using AI? I'm like, well, yeah, we're a game studio, games use AI, but you're not talking about that. Are you talking about predictive business modeling? Are you talking about basically saying, can you get rid of half of your backroom staff because you'll replace them with a barely functional algorithm based spreadsheet that nobody wants? And the idea that sort of AI is in any way close to the level of kind of creative proficiency, it's just flawed. It doesn't work. And back in like the 50s or 60s, you had people like Marvin Minsky, the like early pioneers of AI. And I think it's back in like the late 50s or early 60s, they're going, AI's been around now for about 10 years. The problem is we've solved all the easy questions, but there's no mid questions. Now there's only super hard questions.
Mm.
And I think we're at a really similar kind of place where AI is mass market now, but all the basic easy stuff you can do with AI is being done, but it's not getting better. AI is not vastly increased. And forget the sort of, the kind of like the sort of like evangelistic marketers going, I've created a feature film in 38 minutes using AI. And you think, you haven't. You just haven't. You've created a trailer because
Mm.
like AI video can't hold its consistency for very long. So you're still gonna have to find it's rubbish. It's not true. And everyone said 3D TV. Oh, everything's going to be 3D. No, it wasn't. That bubble went. VR's not changed the world. It's gone back to being it. So AI,
Yeah.
it's what worries me more than AI is the sort of lazy adoption of AI as if it's a panacea. And it's an uncritical, lazy, this will just solve all our problems we can do. And I think if you're approaching game development thinking, how can I make this as easy for myself as possible in that way, you're probably not going to make very good games because, like every other sort of kind of creative art form, kind of grinding through the problems is where you're going to find the lightning in a bottle that makes something really special.
Yeah, completely agree. And also with games, it's like that process is difficult, but that last 5% in shipping is even more difficult. And that's where people fall at that last hurdle. So if you've made the first bit easy, that last bit's going to seem even more difficult, especially if you've got bloody AI code. No one can
Yeah,
debug.
well, I mean,
It's going to be a
yeah,
nightmare.
it's weird. I don't know. Again, I don't know. I've not talked to many actual game developers who want to use it. Again, it feels like it's
Mm.
something that is seen as a cost-cutting wonder pill that comes down from an exec level. And you're thinking, if the people who aren't actually making the games are telling you it's a good idea, and the
Mm.
people who are actually making the games are telling you it's not a good idea, I know which side of the fence I'd probably be happier sitting on.
Yeah, it is one of those decisions that comes in from the exec level. And that's because the investors are investing in it because it's the
Yeah.
latest hype thing. It's sort of, you mentioned VR. I was going to say VR because it came out and it was rubbish. And then it's like it slowly got better. And now mixed reality is kind of a thing. It's taken a while for it to mature into something vaguely usable, but even still not mass market. The other one was like the whole blockchain NFT, like, oh, we're going to take a sword from Zelda
Yeah.
and use it in World of Warcraft. Like, no one's going to do that.
No one's going to do that. No one's going to do that. But it's again, it's that thing of it, like, the value is completely divorced from development because that's the idea of using your Zelda sword in Warcraft adds X points to some company's stock market valuation. So everyone goes, ooh, and they buy that. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's ever going to happen. They're selling the idea of the possibility of something. And if it's enough for people to get behind it, it's vaporware. It's just punting figures around. And it's probably it's not that different from every other industry on the planet where it's kind of there is manufacturing and games is kind of fundamentally manufacturing and there is stock market buy and sell of those manufacturing industries, but it's got nothing to do with the actual product itself. So yeah, it's a weird one. It's a weird one, and I mean, it's kind of. I think it's going to be interesting seeing what happens to sort of like more community game making, because that was sort of the other thing of going, are tools genuinely democratizing? Are they becoming easier? Are we seeing an explosion of grassroots game development? Are those small, very experienced teams able to produce competitive games that they means that they can survive as a small kind of boutique studio? They can make enough money, or are the means of production still so high? And there's the sort of general thing of going, if you are not making basically a kind of an experimental looking or a retro looking independent game, there is still an expectation that you will be hitting a graphical fidelity that is the same as a AAA or
Mm.
double A game. It's not forgiving, which means it's really hard to make a cheap game. Um, so I don't know where that goes. I think that's the other thing, which is kind of to be tracked over the next years of going. It's all very well having 20 years worth of experience, but if you've still got to license engines and you've got to license the middleware and you've got to license everything else and you've got to get some artists on board and lighting and VFX and polish it up so it looks as good as everything else on Steam. So someone who's scanning Steam, they don't care if you're a 3-person team or a 300-person team. They're
Mm.
just going to go to that game look good. Then that's a really big challenge for a small studio.
Yeah, yeah, it's really tricky. And again, like with the lack of funding or it being even harder to get publisher money, it's much more difficult. I think we're going to see more of the smaller teams where it is much easier to keep the lights on, and maybe they freelance or they do co-dev like along the side to keep the lights on while working on their own projects. I've got a few friends that are doing that. And then, yeah, keeping costs down. Like licenses are so expensive for everything. And there are more and more like open source or source available tools like out there now, which is great. But many of us, like myself, I'm mostly a Unity specialist, and the Unity license now is so bloody expensive for the professional
Yeah.
license that, if you are a small studio or even a freelancer working with a studio, therefore you need the pro license, it is silly expensive. I'm
Yeah.
hoping tools like Godot continue to like increase because that
Yeah,
really will democratize it.
I think Godot's great. I would look at that one because I mean the stuff with Jess and I are playing with at the moment. The key thing about it is going. It's his bedroom. This is sort of punk development. We don't want to. We haven't got the money. We're not doing this. So if it means that we are using simpler tools, then fine. We'll find an artistic expression and dressing that fits the sort of limits of what the tools are available. But like you look at Godot and you're going, I don't really see any reason why. Like there's unless you want to produce something with the graphical fidelity of Unreal, like there's no reason to do that. And it's not really viable to do it unless you're an exceptionally skilled Unreal developer. So you kind of have to sort of cut your cloth and go, well, okay, we can't do that. So we'll find an interesting space down here. And I think that's where the best studios have always operated anyway, where they've gone, well, these are the constraints we're operating by. That we don't just go, well, we'd like to be here and we're here. So we just have to work out a way of being here. You go, well, no, we're here. So we make something really good here. And not being able to make it look like, I don't know, whatever, like, um, recently released game like Borderlands 4. We can't do that. Okay, so
No.
let's not try and do that. Let's try and do something else instead. And that's where the best games always sit.
Yeah, it's about being realistic with what you can do on in time and with that budget that you've got. And especially if you're making your own project, it's about like, what are the free tools? What's the easiest, cheapest thing I can do that lowers my risk? Because we've all got a lot of financial risk at the moment with the way the economy is and the job market.
Yeah.
So trying to keep things as simple as possible as well, not just from the financial side, but it'll help you ship sooner, it'll help you ship faster, and you're more likely to get money back in your pocket as well, rather than making this big convoluted thing. Um,
Yeah. I think there is a real, I mean, I kind of like from when I left TCR, it really kind of was that thing of kind of going, you have this thing of going, we'll make AAA, we'll make AAA. And it was all like that. And then, I mean, certainly for me, it kind of got to the point where I went, I don't like this. I don't like I didn't want to make a AAA game. Actually, now I'm actually in here. I don't like this way of developing. I don't like the way we have to operate as a team to get things done. I can't swallow the inefficiencies. They stick too much. And on a very sort of egotistical level, as someone who's basically always written, created, directed everything they do, I'm not doing anything creative anymore, and I'm empowering other people to do the job that I like doing more than this job. And that's, I think, the sort of advice whenever I'm asked by sort of like smaller studios or startups now, what's the sort of one thing, the one sort of bit of advice you reported down? It's always don't grow. Whatever you do, do not grow unless you absolutely have to. You have to have your hand forced. And even then, can you do it temporarily? Can you use freelancers? Can you outsource it? Just don't grow.
Yeah, no, I would actually agree with that. Like, I've loved working with smaller studios, and over time, I've worked with slightly bigger ones. And you see the people that sell to the bigger studios, and they usually do sort of regret it later on because they're forced to do things they don't want to, or yeah, work on projects that don't vibe with them. And it sounds like you're similar to me in a way where you prefer the smaller, quirkier, working on new things, a bit more experimental.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's fun, and I enjoyed, particularly at the beginning of Bloodlines. I loved working with the publishers, working with their IP team because I really loved the VTM IP anyway. So like working with their brand team, with these people that just live, eat, breathe, they know encyclopedic knowledge of this sort of like decades old kind of like RPG system and all the mythos around it. That was loads of fun. It
Mhm.
was just more the sort of thing of going like I was really lucky. Like I worked with that. Like Sarah, who is our lead writer, and ended up because I was working on Deep as well. So like increasingly handing over all these really big scenes there. It's just brilliant. It's just doing great stuff, writing amazing things. I was sitting there going, "It's right that," but I'm glad you're doing it. But it's mainly because actually a few years ago I'd written this whole game myself,
Mhm.
um, and I think it's ungenerous if you have a creative director who's starting to resent the fact that they're not doing any creating. That's not a very generous thing to sort of be, and you have to kind of go, this isn't fair on the team to have someone at the top who's going, I don't really want to be doing this anymore. And also it was very, very burnt out.
Well, yeah, I mean, you had a long stint in Chinese room.
Well, I
That's a
think
long
at
time.
that point I was working when I quit, I was working on 4 projects simultaneously, and that will. There's only so long you can do that for before your brain explodes.
Yeah, no, that's way too much multitasking, especially with lots of different teams. So I guess let's talk a little bit about Bloodlines because you mentioned it there and like how you sort of you were enjoying the writing but couldn't do as much of it as you wanted. So what was the process of getting an IP like that? Because that, as you say, it's such a huge IP, and I guess you want to do it justice, you want to take care of it, but sort of taking over a project that had already been in development as well. That's such a tricky thing to take on.
Yeah, it was. So it was. I got wind of it at a like all the studio heads would like regularly kind of convene on Sheffield to sort of like do sort of like IP discussions, this sort of stuff. And one of the other studios had been asked to pitch for it because it was being taken off hard seat. That was kind of done and dusted. So I know that a lot of people were like, "How could you take another studio's work?" And it's like nobody took another studio's work. That had already happened. So the publisher were going, "We want to try and keep this thing alive. We want to find a studio." And they'd approached one of the other Sumo studios who were like, no, we don't want to do it. And I was trying to push this. I've been pitching around a AAA that I really wanted us to make. And we were getting a lot of the, but your team haven't made a AAA yet kind of response, even though our team was basically made up of AAA veterans. So it's going back to that thing which I said earlier. So I was like, okay, well, we need a stepping stone. That's fine. We can do that. Which probably means working on a pre-existing IP. Okay. There's a limited number of pre-existing IPs I would want to work on that I feel like fits the studio. And then happened to go to this meeting and someone had mentioned it and said, I wouldn't touch that. And I was like, that's great though. Vampire's wonderful. That's fun. So I sort of threw our hat into the ring and then said to the team, I've just thrown our hat into the ring or something. We don't have to do it, but we should talk about it. And there was quite a lot of nerves around the state the game was in. Um, and we knew it was going to be a lot of work, but it's just the opportunity to tell a really good story in that space. And I sort of said when we first started to Paradox, I said before we'd even seen the hard suit build, I was like, well, we're a studio that we've built a reputation on storytelling. We are an original IP studio. The only way we're going to want to do this is if we are able to we'll take everything that's there and use as much as we can. But we don't just want to finish someone else's game. And if you want someone to finish someone else's game, that's fine. That's just not us. And they said, well, we don't. We want to really kind of like pull it apart and put it back together again. So it kind of, in some ways, it was it was like working on a sort of an original IP. It was kind of like, we're going to come from this, we're going to start with a completely new story. We're going to try and take as many of the assets as we can. The engine stuff, the code that we built was very out of date because it was in so rocky for so long with them. They'd not been able to do all the things they wanted to do to it. And you could feel the frustration in the game of a team who were desperately trying to finish something and really, really make their mark of it. But kind of it had just gone south. It just sometimes goes south, and it's got nothing to do with the developers. It's not even to do with developer-publisher relations. Sometimes things just go south. So we knew we wanted to do justice. I really, really was important to do justice to the world and to the mythos. And then I suppose the tricky question around it was Bloodlines 1, which was, are you making a sequel to Bloodlines 1? And right from the word go, there was one of the producers then at Paradox, I'm still friends with, is now with another publisher. We used to sit there and go and have these planning sessions of how do we get them to not call it Bloodlines 2? That feels like the most important thing we do here is to come at this and say, this isn't Bloodlines 2. You can't make Bloodlines 2. There's not enough time. There's not enough money. And Bloodlines 1 came out at a really interesting period of game development when it was the same time as games like Stalker and Shenmue, when you could ship a really ambitious game that was full of bugs and holes, was totally flawed, but the ambition was really exciting.
Mm.
And a lot of those games, they're real cult games now, but they really weren't very good when you actually broke them apart and analysed them. Great ideas, wonderful ideas, players love them. You couldn't get away with it now.
Mm.
So trying to recreate that magic in a different environment felt wrong-headed. Like, no one would be happy. You wouldn't make the people who love Bloodlines 1 happy, and you wouldn't make people who didn't know about Bloodlines 1 happy, because they'd never get Bloodlines 2, and they'd always get a flawed game that was built too fast and with not enough money. So we kind of approached it from that point of view, really, of going, well, what can we do with the time, the money that's available? And at that point, what actually pitched weirdly was kind of, which would probably make, I can hear the psychic scream of Bloodlines 1 players from across the net, but I came in and went, we can't make Bloodlines 2, we can't make Skyrim, but we can make Dishonored. And if we sort of like look at something which is not an RPG and is not fully open world, but is really tightly focused and true to the mythos, and it's a good ride, we get a Bloodlines title out in the world. And then we'd started talking about saying, well, what would the next big Bloodlines game look like after that, if that happened? And you go, yay! And then everything just goes like that. And everyone feeds in, yes, but this, but yes, but this, but yes, but this, the players, this, and the community, this and that. And then, like every other game, it becomes then a sort of a kind of untangling an anaconda fuckball of competing priorities and what everybody wants and things like that. So it was always going to be tricky, but it was, I don't know. I had a lot of fun writing the story on that one. It was really good. And I think, because the mythos around the RPG, so it's brilliant. It's really dark, contemporary, political, queer. It's such a modern mythos and such a rare depth and detail to it, that it was being buried in that for a couple of years was probably the best part of the project for me, of kind of going, there's something really interesting to unpick here.
Yeah, it's honestly like, yeah, the IP and the lore is wonderful. Like, I only recently got into playing the tabletop game and absolutely love it. It's so good. And I know there's new
Yeah.
editions, but we were playing like the first and second editions just because it still holds up. It still holds
Yeah,
up
it's
way back.
amazing. And because it's so heavily story driven, it's like it's kind of, it's actually mechanically it's quite light, and it's all about going, how do we get players really deep into this world as much as we can.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, it's wonderful.
yeah.
And yeah, so the game's out now. What I'll do is when I share this, I will put links in the show notes for people. I'm sure many of them can find it, but I'll do that anyway. But one of the things we've touched on briefly there was sort of how you left partway through the project, and leaving studio is like, well, any project you've worked on is the hardest thing to do, especially partway through. And you mentioned you weren't really enjoying sort of the creative direction when you couldn't do the writing as much, and definitely a bit of burnout there.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely very, very burnt out when I left, and it was the middle of the pandemic, which was horrendous.
Right.
And we personally had a very, very difficult pandemic, as a lot of people did. And priorities change, and you kind of looking at things of going, this is what is going on outside. I'm killing myself at work. I'm working stupid hours. I'm working 7 days a week. I'm trying to keep multiple projects afloat. Um, it's not fair on the team because I've got none of these teams are getting the amount of attention they need. Um, we didn't have the infrastructure at the top level of the studio to cope with the multiple projects on a creative level. Um, like quite a lot of people came in after I left and they hired like 3 people. I was probably doing 3 people's jobs. We'd had a really big problem with some shake up with some people leaving that left us very vulnerable for a while. And we spent probably us doing like my job. I was also doing I was basically covering for design director across all of those projects as well as creative director while we were rehiring for a design director that had huge impact on the team. So from a kind of personal point of view, I think the clock was ticking in terms of you leave before you collapse, which I think is probably something which is fairly common to a lot of people in that position. From a team point of view, I think it was probably, I imagine, I don't know if it was difficult for the teams when I left. I hope so, in that sort of weird kind of way. Like I hope it wasn't, but I kind of also hope I was missed a
Mm.
little bit. Um, but they needed more than I could give them. I think more than any one individual could give them. And I think on a personal level, just kind of going, yeah, it felt like it was, TCR evolved into something that wasn't the same thing that Jess and I started. And that's okay. That happens. Evolutions happen. But at the same time, you kind of have to, from a personal point of view, go, this isn't what I want to be doing anymore. Um, so yeah, I think it was just sort of one of those sort of mixes between a decision which I in no way regret, but very, very, very hard at the time. And again, you have to take very, very seriously going, I've got responsibilities to all of these people. And what does it mean if the creative director leaves partway through a project? Um, that's something there. That's a wave they're going to have to ride, and the other people on the management team are going to have to deal with and support their teams through. So it's never to be done lightly. But I think the one thing is that the games industry is so volatile. It's not the first time, it won't be the last time that a CD's disappears from a project halfway through.
No, no, it won't be the last time, I am sure, but it sounds like it was the right call for you. Like, a very, very difficult
Yeah.
decision, but there's that whole analogy of, like, look after yourself so you can look after others, and if you're not looking after yourself, you can't look after the people on your team or that creative project because you can't give it what it needs, so, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I've always been. I mean, if there's one thing I would do probably a bit differently with my career, which is a very difficult thing to say. I've always been tried to be incredibly nurturing and empowering and go, no, you take this, you take this, you take this, you take this. And I think too late, I felt that probably what I ought to have done is just grabbed the games and said, this is going to be made my way. But I'm not really that sort of person anyway. And I think you can't really do that when you've got a big team. And I
Mhm.
know game directors that do behave like that, and I don't like them. So I didn't really want to be that person. But I think there was a definite degree of kind of going in another time. I would probably have adapted my leadership style.
Mm.
Um, but I think given the circumstances and given everything else going on, that wasn't really the appropriate time or place to do that.
Yeah, it sounds like a good lesson learned for whatever is
Yeah.
next. And so
Yeah.
we're at time. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I would love to know. Yeah, you mentioned you and Jess are working on a little something, and you've been out of like the Chinese room for a couple of years now. I would love to know, like, can you say what you're working on next, or is it just something?
Yeah, a little bit. So I mean, both of us have really just kind of gone back to being artists, of sort of going, well, we made these games sort of like as kind of an extension of just that sort of very meandering artistic process. It's just where we worked, ended up for a couple of years. So Jess is writing. She just shipped an album this year called Shielding Songs, which is amazing. It's done really, really well of choral music. Um, and she's working on that. I'm writing novels and novellas, and I'm in the very, very slow process of that, which is really nice when the only technical difficulty you have to deal with in terms of creativity is does word work, as opposed to I've got to corral all this C# code. And then we started working on a little game. We started talking about it probably. We've been talking about it for a little while, but we started really talking about it last year, and we've gradually started making it now. We've been really, really lucky. We've got a bit of prototype money from the UK Games Fund, who are amazing. And yeah, I could sing their praises for a very, very long time. I think their attitude towards game making, they're very sort of, particularly Paul Durant's a real voice of wisdom in terms of how to survive as a business whilst not getting into that like endless growth cycle and stuff. So we get a bit of prototype money from them. So we're working on a prototype for something at the moment that is very much, I suppose, a return to our roots conceptually. So not a walking simulator, not like Dear Esther, but definitely something that is art house, experimental, and we can afford to be uncompromising with because we're making it ourselves. So it's not something where we're sort of going, we have to make £1 million or we're going to go to prison. So we have to do all these things to make it work. We can actually just go, what does it feel like this game needs and wants? Which is lovely. It's really, really nice to be sort of like back in a position of going, we're making a game for ourselves, because we want to. And that's, that's a real privilege. I'm not sort of, I never take for granted how lucky we've been. And I think you make your own luck, but you also have to be lucky. And I think I remember years and years ago, I wrote a book on as an academic. I wrote a book about Doom, and I got to go over to meet the id team and met John Carmack. And I kept saying, but you made Doom. And he was just like, someone was going to. We just made it first. And I was like, no. And he went, yeah. I went, no. He went, yeah. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. But
Oh, nice.
yes, they made it first, but they also made it really, really well. And I think Dear Esther was a game which landed at a perfect time. The stars were really aligned. Steam had just launched. They were looking for titles. We, not through any sort of deliberate choice, we made it in source because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, which means Valve went, oh, you've made it in source. No games get made in source. So they put it on the front page. And, there's a combination of factors. So yeah, it was really good, but it was also the right thing in the right place at the right time. I think particularly for studios starting now, I think the landscape is so much harder than it was in 2012, where if you made a relatively good game that felt quite different, you could get a lot of exposure, as opposed to now, I don't even know how you get seen unless you're very, very lucky. So the idea of, I'm really sort of aware of how much of a sort of like, privilege that is, that we get to sort of now go, well, okay, we did well in the industry. We got to make these games. I'm really proud of the games we made. And now we get to make a game in a completely uncompromising way. So I don't know. It could take a long time to make. We'll just see. Gently making it, seeing where it leads us, and at some point, I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit more.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, perhaps we'll get you back on when it's ready and you can talk a bit more about it because I'm
Yeah.
super intrigued. Dan, thank you so much. This has been such a sort of interesting, insightful, but also really inspiring chat. And there's bits of
Thank you.
information and advice in there for everybody. And yeah, I think hopefully that will encourage a lot of people as well. And I think, honestly, for me, the biggest takeaway there is just that reminder that you don't have to grow a studio to this huge size. You can keep it small, you can keep it nimble and indie. And often that is the right way to do it. And I'm very happy for you that you've been able to go back to that and work in a way that you enjoy and, yeah, get to work with Jess again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think it's it. I think the sort of like the big advice that sort of I always get from sort of like saying to people now, especially sort of like just been working with some students recently, and they're like, what's your advice about going in the games industry? And I think one is there's easier, less painful ways to make money. So don't go into it for the money, go into it for the right reasons. And two, I think the really fundamental one is the games you like playing and the games you like making are not the same games. And really figure that out, that if you're going to go into the industry, don't even consider your favorite games into it. Just look for studios with good studio culture who look after their people. That's all that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Working with good people and having that team around you is, the most important thing because your day-to-day environment is what will make or break your career and make you decide, you want to stick with it or not. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
very, very
100%.
good advice. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan. It was absolutely lovely chatting to you. I will put all the links to everything you've mentioned in the show notes for everybody as well. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.